Hello everyone, by which of course I mean the world, the internet, and naturally Jason Isaacs. We're back with an evaluation of the British Constitution, as it says up there. This is very much a companion piece to a more mechanical or technical evaluation of the British Constitution, which I'll try to remember to link off to, definitely down in the chat or elsewhere, somewhere above here. But what we're doing here is we're looking at an analysis of the British Constitution that will hopefully bleed into an evaluation. In other words, is it actually any good? It is designed primarily for people who are doing an A-level in politics, but hopefully it will be of more use to the general public, and we'll come straight back with it after the introduction. So cue the music and see you in a second. Bye now. And thanks to Oscar for the intro, thanks to Microsoft for the snazzy graphics. Now, before we go any further, we will start off with a brief recap, and we'll look at the constitutional principles and we'll look at the constitutional sources. Now, this thing here, I often say that the constitutional principles run all the way through the Constitution like Brighton through rock, and I should probably try to explain exactly what I mean by that. Well, that's what I mean. Now, this comes back to Dicey, and Dicey argues that the constitutional principles are not from the declarations of the rulers, but rather they're inferred from British legal history. I've got a quote on the next page that goes into that in more detail. But throughout all of this, the three that are most important are these ones here: parliamentary sovereignty, the rule of law, and parliamentary government. The unitary state and the constitutional monarchy are definitely interesting, but when it comes to assessing the effectiveness of the British Constitution, they're very much downstream or down the line there. Of course, if Scotland does vote for independence, or if we do decide to do away with the monarch with the Windsors, then those two are going to become much more interesting, but we'll worry about that when it happens. Now, these are the constitutional principles, and they exist in history, or the general principles of the British Constitution arise not from the declarations of the rulers, but from the decisions made in individual cases by an independent judiciary. So essentially they're inferred from history. And they're not admissible in court. They don't really work in the real world. What works in the real world are the constitutional sources. This is how we generally interact with the Constitution, particularly through those first two there. And the order there matters. Statute law is the highest form of it's the highest form of law in the land. Nearly said constitutional law. We don't have constitutional law. All laws are effectively part of our constitution because of parliamentary sovereignty, and because parliamentary sovereignty establishes the supremacy of acts of parliament over all other forms of law, then naturally it follows that statute law is the highest form of law in the land. Then that obviously goes all the way down here, and works of authority. I'm going to be referring a lot to Dicey in the course of this particular presentation, but you've also got Erskine May and Bagehot, and hopefully at some point in my videos. But really, the important thing I just want to keep coming back to is statute law. This is the highest form of law in the land. Why? Because it comes from our democratically elected representatives. And so it kind of follows that this is what we want, and therefore this should be the highest form of law within the UK. Now, when we were members of the EU, obviously all of our laws had to be consistent with the EU law, so that might have looked like the EU law was superior to the UK law, but that's not strictly true. The reason why that was the case was because we passed legislation saying that while we're members of the EU club, we will play by the EU game, and therefore all of our statute laws by necessity must be consistent with EU law. Of course, now we've left the EU, that's essentially irrelevant, but it's worth just chucking it out there. So, 5 constitutional principles, 5 constitutional sources. I strongly advise that you learn them because it makes life very interesting. Well, I would say that. I mentioned Dicey earlier, and here he is. Important here, as he says, our constitution is a judge-made law. The Constitution is not that of a single revolutionary moment like the United States or like America or like France, but rather we infer our constitutional principles from the mists of time, and particularly through these decisions made in individual cases by an independent judiciary. So at no point does anybody sort of sit down and say, well, these are the general principles of the Constitution. Dicey argues we infer them from legal history, and that's important because it follows that if these are not essentially within the gift of our rulers, then the rulers don't get to change our constitutional principles. They can only evolve over time. I'd love to get into a discussion with somebody who really knows what they're talking about in terms of constitutional law on that front, but we'll park that for the time being. The important thing is that these constitutional principles are out there, they're not laws, and therefore they're not admissible in our courts. That's perhaps the single most important thing to take away from that. Right, so let's move into a discussion of the strengths and weaknesses of the British Constitution. If you want to know where our Constitution is, there it is. This is the Law Library. I believe it's in Parliament. These are all of the laws that we've ever passed, or certainly when we were still writing them on vellum, we parked them all in this particular library, and yeah, there it is. So the British Constitution is written down. It's just not codified in a single document, but rather it's codified in every single law that Parliament has ever placed. Worth pointing out at this juncture that every time Parliament passes a law, there's that sense of implicit repeal, that if it is incompatible with the prior law, then the new law takes precedent and the old law is essentially null and void. Of course, the only point where that is not relevant is the Human Rights Act, and I discussed that in my previous video. So let's look at the strengths and weaknesses of the British Constitution, and I'm going to start, as I often do, with a structural analysis of the British Constitution. And the important point to take from that is that the structure of our British Constitution is essentially one of parliamentary democracy. If you look at parliamentary sovereignty, and if you look at parliamentary government, and if you look at the rule of law, it clearly establishes that the dominant figure in the British Constitution is Parliament. And that's entirely right, because it's the only institute that we vote for on a national basis. And so it should follow that we, the political sovereigns, transfer our sovereignty to the legal sovereigns, and we ask them to organise our civil state for us. That makes perfect sense. So Parliament then is legally supreme. They create the highest form of law in the land. Government derives its authority from the support of Parliament, and of course the rule of law establishes that everybody is subject to those rules of Parliament, including, very, very importantly, government. So government can, and often does, break the law, of which more in many, many other videos. So, in theory, then, we have this concept of a parliamentary democracy where our constitutional principles very, very clearly establish that Parliament sits in the box seat, and quite right too, because they are the only institution that we vote for on a national basis. However, Parliament has a problem. Well, Parliament kind of has two problems, but I'm zeroing here on the House of Commons. In terms of Parliament in general, there is an institutional imbalance in that the House of Lords is not elected and therefore does not have the same level of authority or power as the House of Commons. But let's just focus on the House of Commons for the time being, because there you have a very, very important problem, and that is the compliant majority. Parliament is neither independent nor neutral, nor is it particularly expert. It's not neutral because government enjoys a majority. That's why it gets to be government. Our electoral system, in the main, will return a majority government or a majority of MPs, of one stripe or the other, to the House of Commons. Now, the sine qua non, the best example of that was in 2005, where Blair got a 36% vote in the national poll. In terms of the popular vote, he came in at 36% of the vote, but because of the vagaries and the weirdness of our system, that gave him 55% of the House of Commons. Now, I've done some calculations and I refer to them later, but since 1979, the share of the popular vote comes out at around about 38-39%, possibly even 40%. But in terms of the way in which that translates into share of the House, that transfers into 53% of the House, which is weird. Well, and we'll leave it at that for the time being. So we have a majority in the House of Commons that will belong to one party or the other. First problem. The second problem is that party discipline means that majority is slavishly loyal to its political masters, to the point that we would say it was compliant. So we've got a massively polarised House of Commons and an incredibly partisan House of Commons. Now that means that it's really going to struggle to do its job. If its job is to assess with any degree of objectivity the work of government, it's just not going to happen, because the government has that majority, and that majority is slavishly compliant to its political masters. So we have a situation whereby Parliament is dramatically ill-equipped to do its job because it is neither neutral nor independent. And if you want to be really cruel, you could even go on to say they're not particularly expert. They don't really know what they're doing. And if you look at the current crop, then I'm afraid that kind of proves the point beyond any reasonable doubt. So when it comes to parliamentary democracy, in theory, it looks great, because all of our constitutional principles point towards this idea of Parliament being in the box seat, parliamentary democracy, Parliament passing the right laws, Parliament holding the government to account. But in reality, we know that that doesn't happen, because the House of Commons is neither neutral nor independent nor expert, and the House of Lords simply doesn't have the authority to do it because no one has voted for them. So when it comes to parliamentary democracy, the net result has to be perceived as disappointing at best and woefully inadequate at worst. So parliamentary democracy, not great. We now look at the way in which the principles combine to give the state, our political masters, the means to manage the civil state through the application or through the sources, to be precise. And the idea is that the sources of the Constitution, so particularly we're thinking about statute law and common law, give the state the means to manage the civil state and to create a civil state that fits our democratic expectations and demands. And they do, in that the state has a working level of flexibility, if you like. They have the means to create legislation that reflects the times. And my favourite one for all of this is the Firearms Amendment Acts of 1997. You'll remember that these laws were passed in the wake of the Dunblane massacre, which was obviously a terrible occasion. But it does give us the way to see how our Constitution is radically different from the United States. We could also be looking at the Abortion Act in 1967 if we wanted to, because here we can just see the state saying, well, look, it looks like we should be doing something about this, let's pass a law. And because we have parliamentary sovereignty, Parliament can make that law. So whether it's the Abortion Act of 67 or the Firearms Amendment Acts of 97, then we don't have to worry about referring back to some document that was written in 1789 that seems to set out a set of rules and determining compatibility with that particular document. So parliamentary sovereignty says, and I've written it there, so I'm not going to bother writing it out for you, reading it out, sorry, that Parliament can make the laws that it needs to run the state. And so in theory, again, that looks fantastic. We're not going to get into questions of constitutionality. We're not going to get into issues as to whether or not it's compatible with a document that was written 200 or 300 years ago. The problem, however, and of course there is a problem, is that perhaps that gives Parliament too much latitude to create laws that are perhaps not that great. And I've got a couple of examples down here. We're looking at the Rwanda bill at the moment. It's still, at time of going to press or going to camera, it's still engaged in parliamentary ping pong. And here we have the government trying to persuade Parliament to enact hope into fact. Parliament is, the government has determined for good or ill that Rwanda is safe. Our courts have determined that it's not. However, the government is trying to persuade Parliament to pass a law saying that Rwanda is safe, and if that is the case, then Rwanda does become safe, and the courts no longer have any input on that particular debate. That is just quite clearly insane. And yet here we are, and I refer you back to my Rwanda presentation, where we can go into that in much more detail. So, in one sense, you've got a parliament who can legislate that up and down, that up is down, that cats are dogs, as was memorably put. That Rwanda is safe when we know that it's not. That's one problem there. We've got another problem there, is that all of our rights, as we understand them, are simply written in law, and so Parliament could pass legislation removing the Human Rights Act, and that would happen overnight. And the sort of legislation that would come in there based upon this lot's current agenda, I invite you to consider what that might be. It's worth noting that, as we've discussed earlier, the courts can only uphold law, not the Constitution. Miller too brought the courts into a very, very tricky position indeed, in that it looked like the courts were upholding the principle of parliamentary government, and they had to work very, very hard to present their decision in a way that it was quite clearly based on only in law. Again, I don't have time to go into this. I do it in another presentation, so do please go and have a look at that. But perhaps my favourite one, and it's one that I haven't written down there, is the famous or the infamous Leg Reg Bill of 2006, which in its original form would have given government the right to create binding legislation of its own. Now, that is quite clearly incompatible with the principle of parliamentary sovereignty. And when challenged on the matter, Blair said, well, of course, we wouldn't use it like that, to which the response is, well, yeah, that's what they always say, first time around. So the Leg Reg Bill was originally going to give government the right to create binding primary legislation. That was changed, and eventually the legislation was passed. But the issue here is, how do you protect democracy or rights or indeed anything from Parliament if Parliament can pass any legislation it deems fit? And the answer to that is that our Constitution hinges entirely on good people doing the right thing. If bad people choose to do bad things, there's very, very little that our Constitution can do to prevent that. And that's what we saw with prorogation. That's what we see with the Rwanda bill. That's what we saw with so many other things that I'm not going to get into right now, because I do get into it at the end. Our Constitution relies on good people doing the right thing, and when you have bad actors in place, and Parliament is again dominated by a majority loyal to that bad actor and utterly beholden to that bad actor, then we have a position, we find ourselves in a position where bad things can happen, and bad things at the moment do seem to be happening. So that's a democratic civil state. Scary. Okay, let's move on to the cultural round. And again, this is what happens when we take the concepts that we've been discussing and release them into a wider social context. And the way I've chosen to look at this is from the position of a functional liberal democracy. Right, so it's worth reminding ourselves at this point that democracy is a system of government predicated on popular sovereignty. And I do apologise to those poor subjects in my classes who have had to endure that for a long time. But yeah, there you go. If you know a better definition of democracy, by all means let me know. However, we've already sort of established this point that the existing arrangements, certainly de jure, that is by law, suggest the legitimacy of state institutions. We've got parliamentary democracy, blah, 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 blah. We counter that with the de facto establishment of the elective dictatorship. So this is your counter. This is the first bit of your counter. And to a certain extent, we've already dealt with that. But now I want to get into the idea that I touched on earlier, and that is that the electoral system vastly distorts the popular support for Parliament and government. I gave you the 2005 data earlier. I've just clarified it there. It was 35%. 55% of the seats of the House of Commons. So what this means is, well, it's rather like this. If the government turns up and says, well, this is what the people want, well, manifestly that's not true. On this occasion, 75% of those who voted wanted something else. And let's not forget that in 2005, the actual turnout was below 60%. So the vast majority of this country may or may not have wanted it, but they certainly didn't make it clear when they voted that this was what they wanted. So in other words, you've got a vastly exaggerated mandate. 55% of the people didn't want this. Only 35% of those who turned out voted for it, and 31% in 2005 couldn't be asked to even get out and vote. So what we've got here is a really, really important position in terms of, establishing that democratic legitimacy, because they're claiming legitimacy that they simply don't have. And we've certainly been seeing that with the Conservatives. I picked on Boris Blair there because that was a particularly egregious example. But this is really what we're seeing, particularly with the latest conservative governments where they're saying this is what the people want. Well, no, it's clearly not, or it's not necessarily what the people want. You can't present this as a proven fact if your share of the vote is certainly below 50%, comfortably below 50%. This is not what the people want, and so you shouldn't really be in a position to steamroll your legislation through Parliament. This is where I think that coalition governments and reduced majorities they make life more hard for government, and that's got to be right. If this government actually succeeds in passing one of the most terrible bits of legislation I've ever seen in the shape of the Rwanda bill, hey, look, if people want to deal with small boats, then deal with small boats, but you don't do that by creating legislation that steamrollers Parliament into declaring a country is safe when we know it's not, and then taking jurisdiction for that decision out of the hands of the courts. It's bonkers. It's wrong. It's beyond wrong. But anyway, I'm ranting, and I didn't mean to rant today. The key issue here is this is what the people want. Well, not really. In a democracy, you should have a situation of popular sovereignty where this is what we ask for, and should more than 59% of people got out to vote in 2005, yes, they should have done. Should more than what was the turnout in the 19 election? Was it 67%? Should we have had more people turning out to vote? Yeah, ideally. But at the same time, the government can't be claiming a national mandate that it simply doesn't have. But our system allows it to do that, and with that comes all sorts of terrible consequences. So, to what extent does our system reflect to what extent does our system reflect popular sovereignty? Well, it doesn't. If 39% of the people voted for the party, but they get 55% of the House, then that can't be democratic authority. Just flicking back to look at the last election. So in the last election, it was 43.6% of the House that voted for Johnson, as it was there, and then that translated into 57.4% of the chamber, which again, is that a mandate? Well, I suppose it's a mandate of sorts, but is it a clear democratic mandate? Well, I'm not entirely convinced. Perhaps you are, in which case do feel free to let me know in the comments. I'm sure you will anyway. So we do have significant problems at each stage of this process. It looks like we've got parliamentary sovereignty, but when we look into that, the tail wags the dog. It looks like we've got a working level of flexibility, but on the other hand, maybe there's a little bit too much flex in the model, and we would like some greater strictures on what Parliament can and cannot do with its legislation. And in terms of the outcome of the election reflecting democracy, well, quite clearly, here we have a problem too. So all in all, there are significant problems with the British Constitution. And these have been like that since the beginning of recorded time. But arguably, it's only been the tumult of the last however many years that's really made it abundantly evident. I suppose you could possibly look around and say, during Thatcher administration, when Thatcher was undertaking her changes, she was operating at 43.9%, 42.4%, 42% of the popular vote. Did that give her the right to implement the reforms that she did? Well, we can argue the toss on that perhaps another day. So I hope we can agree that recent constitutional history has demonstrated that our constitution is not perhaps as robust and perfect as we would like. I'll explain what that looks like in a couple of essay plans in a minute, but before we get on to that, let's have a quick look at the role of shame. You could argue that in some of these instances I've been, perhaps a little fierce. Well, again, you're welcome to tell me. With Sunak, I would argue he's got no mandate. He didn't win an election. Again, we'll see that that's something that comes up quite a lot. And the Rwanda legislation is egregious beyond any reasonable measure. Truss, well, again, she had no mandate, didn't win an election. And then embarked upon the omnishambles budget, where she essentially just bypassed cabinet entirely. Cabinet was not involved in that decision at all. So again, we're seeing recent prime ministers just essentially ignoring the constitution. With Johnson, I could go on forever, but again, let's look at prorogation. That was, as far as I'm concerned at any rate, entirely unconstitutional. The courts found it unlawful. Well done, the courts. He also lied to Parliament repeatedly and knowingly. And again, I would argue that he abused the nature of cabinet government. All of these are constitutional problems where we have a constitutional solution, that is Parliament do your blinking job, but as we mentioned earlier, Parliament is neither neutral, independent nor expert, and so it's probably not going to do so. Let's go back to Cameron. Well, again, perhaps a bit of a reach there, but I would argue that he used national policy to try to manage problems entirely within his own party. But then in the interests of balance, let's go to Brown. And Brown obviously had no mandate because he didn't win an election. And with Blair, we have the abnegation of cabinet over the Iraq war. And again, lying to Parliament over the Iraq war. So yeah, equal opportunities abuser, all of them equally worthless in my eyes. I actually bumped into Cameron the other day. Oh, the things I wanted to say. Anyway, in the spirit of L'Escalier. So, what does that look like if you're trying to write an essay on any of this? Well, to what extent is the Constitution fit for purpose? We deal with parliamentary democracy, then the working level of flexibility, and then the culture of liberal democracy. And at every stage, I hope you can see there that we have one hand, other hand, etc., etc., etc. I'll let you pause that and read that in your own time. Move on to the idea that the codification, would all of our problems be solved if we codified our constitution? Now, here's a huge, great amorphous topic. And when I get to a huge subject like that, something I will often do is I'll work backwards. I'll start with the points I want to make. So I'll think about, okay, what are the points here that I want to make? Well, on one hand, if we have a written constitution, then that's incompatible with parliamentary sovereignty and it invites judicial rule. And, those of you who are doing the United States will know all about that. Also, we have no facility for creating constitutional law. So if we wanted to create a written constitution, we'd have to have a whole new set of institutions, one of which was capable of writing constitutional law. That's not impossible, but we would have to do that. We'd have to create some new constitutional convention, or however we wanted to describe it, and then somehow give that power to write constitutional law, something that couldn't be reversed through parliamentary sovereignty. And hopefully now you're starting to see the problem. I don't know how we do that, but then again, that's why I'm not a constitutional scholar or indeed an advisor to the government. And finally, I think the chances of achieving consensus are vanishingly thin. We had the Brexit referendum 2016, and we're still arguing about that. And that was based upon a European agreement, Maastricht, that was essentially defined in 94, having been redefined every year before that. Oh God, we could be here forever. But my point that I'm making here is I start with the points that I'm trying to make. These are the conclusions that I want to reach. And of course, the overall conclusion that we should add up to here is that we don't need a new constitution, we just need to use the one that we've got properly. And I think that, if I was looking at this essay, I'd probably come up with something along those lines. In many senses, what I'm doing is I'm just moving around the tiles that I had in the previous essay plan, but hey, that's how you write an essay, to be brutally honest. And that is pretty much it from me. I hope you found that interesting and helpful. If you have, please do let me know. If you haven't, well, fair enough. Let me know about that as well. And if you want to swing to the defence of any of those prime ministers that I've introduced earlier, then you're welcome to do that too. But constructive criticism, always welcome, and always willing to listen and hopefully do things better next time. And if there's anything else you want me to look at, then please do give me a shout. This is Paul Talks Politics. I'm Paul. I've been talking politics, and I look forward to talking to you again very, very soon. Take care now.